This is the Rebel HR Podcast, the podcast about all things innovation in the people space. I'm Kyle Rode. Let's start the show. Welcome back, Rebel HR listeners. Extremely excited for this week's show. With us, we have Tricia Montalvo Timm. She is the author of the book that is available now where books are sold. Embrace the power of you, owning your identity at work. Tricia, welcome to the show.
Hi, Kyle. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are extremely excited to have you on the show. And I think today's topic is a really, really important one and a timely one for us HR professionals to hear. So the first question that I have for you, as I have for all of the authors on my show, is what motivated you to put in the time, energy, and in some cases heartburn to write a book about owning your identity at work?
That's such a great question. And I like how you said heartburn because my book, not only for all authors, it's an incredible amount of time and effort, but in my book is very vulnerable and tell a lot about my personal story. So there's a lot of unpacking and healing. And as my developmental editor said, the first draft was the healing draft. So let's see. Let me tell you a little bit about myself professionally and personally. Professionally, I've been working in high tech for over 25 years as a general counsel, outside lawyer, working with large, big companies to multinational companies to small startups and everything in between. But on the personal side, I am the daughter of two immigrants. My mother is from El Salvador. My father is from Ecuador. And I grew up in Los Angeles, California, and they wanted, like many immigrants, the American dream for our family. And at an early age, they moved us sort of out of the city into the suburbs. And all of a sudden found myself as the only in my community. I was the, only or one of the few Latino families in a predominantly white community. And, they had suffered from discrimination themselves and wanted a different life for me. And they encouraged me out of, love to downplay where we came from, downplay and to assimilate and belong. And that was really that generation's, goal was to assimilate. And so I did. And I did that through school, law school, and my career. And so the book is really about that journey and the cost of assimilation, because what happens is when you hide or downplay any part of yourself, whether it's your race, your religion, sexual orientation, learning disability, mental health conditions, all of these things that we don't want others to know about, we're not bringing a really critical piece of who we are to the workplace. And that's not only physically and emotionally exhausting for the person who's hiding, but it's also a sad consequence for our workplace because we need all those lived experiences in the workplace. So the book is really my way of telling my story to normalize what that might feel like for people and provide strategies to get on the other side of that journey.
Absolutely. And, I think it's fascinating to hear, that context. And I think it's important for many of us to hear, especially those of us that, don't have that lived experience and don't have that context. I think it's also been interesting to see in the workplace. There's been, a little bit of a tidal wave of employers being asked to embrace the differences that their teams have and to allow people to bring their authentic selves to work. In your experience and in your context, as you look at some of this changing expectation as it relates to our workplaces, is it happening fast enough, or are there other things that we need to be thinking about and other tactics that we need to really focus on in human resources to really embrace this and allow people to truly be themselves in the workplace?
I don't think it's happening fast enough. And that's just the challenge with DEI work. When I, at my last job, I was head of DEI, and There's always a group of people that said we're doing things too fast, and another group of people that are saying we're doing things too slow, and we moved somewhere in the middle. What I think is, companies were there was a lot of pressure to diversify the workplace. And so there have been a lot of efforts around that from corporations to increase diversity. But the challenge is when you then bring in diverse employees into the workplace, how are they going to feel there? And that's where the inclusivity and belonging piece is so important. And, one of the benefits I have of kind of sitting in both spaces of sort of the C-suite space or dominant space and also the space of people of color, women of color, is when I'm in the spaces of people of color, they are burnt out. It is incredibly hard to try to fit in and try to, bring their authentic selves to the workplace. And so they are trying to do a lot of their work to try to survive in this environment with very few playbooks or mentors or, all of the tools needed to succeed. And there's not that same urgency, I would say, at leadership from trying to create that inclusive workplace. Really, the pressure is just to diversify. And so I think there's an urgency is how do we retain our very talented, diverse workforce? Because you see a lot of people deciding to leave workplaces that don't create that environment.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting to reflect on that because, and I think many HR professionals would agree that much of the work that we have done has been fairly reactive, and it's been, hey, even down to the numbers we track, like, what is the percent of diverse candidates that we hire, right? I think it's a little bit more rare to see an organization that says, what are diversity statistics in our turnover metrics, right?
Yeah.
And truly answering the honest question, why are these individuals leaving?
Yeah.
And is there a common thread, and is there truly a root cause? Because the reality is when you really start to unpack, you might not like the answers
right
that you get. Right. And I think sometimes we have to confront those harsh truths.
And those statistics, I think, are really critical for companies during, exit interviews, really asking those hard questions and reflecting and tracking that, as well as promotions. How are we doing in promoting people? What does that metric look like? So there's a lot that can be tracked there for sure.
Absolutely. And I think, from my perspective, this is something that leaders own, human resources owns. There has to be some ownership in the leadership team and in the management team, and especially in human resources that, this stuff matters, right? This is really what matters. As you reflect on the personal experience of somebody that is, coming from a point of being, being the other in the room was the terminology that you used before we hit record. Why is it so important for every individual to truly be able to own their identity at work?
We'll be back after a quick break.
And so used to having everything in front of them right away that we forget that innovation just takes time. I myself, I get frustrated too. Why? And this as being one of my best friends is, hey, I talk to you all the time. Hey, man, I'm frustrated in the fact that I can't seem to just get there in the next day. But that's just not how these things work, right? Innovation needs to be planned out. It needs to be very methodical. And then when it finally hits, that's when it seems like to everyone else that it sort of just came out of nowhere. But to you, the amount of dedication that it took over that time.
A couple of different reasons. One is, studies show that people who bring their authentic selves to the workplace are going to be happier. They're going to be, thriving in their professions, and you're going to retain your employees. So I think that is important, just in terms of retaining and also having fulfilling careers. But also, I think what is also important is our society is diverse. We come from different lived experiences. And if we are asking our employees to come in and not bring their authentic self to work, or not create spaces that are inclusive, then you're lacking that perspective, that unique perspective in designing and marketing different products to people. You see the lack of diversity in media. You see the lack of product design. You see the lack of, when you do search terms, for example, on Google. And now look at AI. What is AI going to be doing, and how is, what are they? What is that technology grabbing? That's going to then produce the next, information. So, I think, for example, I'm a Latina. The Latino market is the fastest growing demographic market in the country. I think there's a $2.8 trillion of buying power. And I think the GDP of the Latino community is, I want to say it's the fourth, or if it was on a GDP basis, the fourth or fifth largest in the world. Yet we're not creating or designing products to address that market. And part of it is because we just don't have any Latinos in leadership. There have only been 2 female Latina CEOs. We are less than 2% in the boardroom, less than 1% in the C-suite. And so that lack of voice to provide the ideas and innovation that can produce actually, results for companies is lacking. And so I think it's important that we encourage all, people from all different perspectives to be comfortable voicing their ideas, voicing who they are, bringing those perspectives so we can address all communities.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think first of all, let's start. Only 2 Latina CEOs.
Fortune 500 company.
Fortune 500. Okay.
Yeah.
That's shocking.
Yeah, it is shocking. Yeah.
You hear these statistics.
And if you think, the statistics are crazy. And I'm doing some now venture investing, and for Latina entrepreneurs, the amount of capital they're receiving is 0.2% of venture capital money goes to Latina entrepreneurs, and they're getting 0 funding. So it's just, the statistics are shocking. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think it's important to be honest with ourselves about that, right? Because that's a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that I think is really important. First of all, I think the business case for authenticity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging here. If you just Google it, you can find there's so many validated studies that it's just good business. But at the end of the day, it's also just the right thing to do. Right. And so it's like, there's very few things in this world where you're like, well, this is a really good money-making opportunity. Oh, by the way, it's the decent and right thing to do as a society. So I struggle with individuals that maybe, don't understand why we should do this, on a broader level. So what's your perspective on that? I mean, why are we in 2023 still struggling with such an underrepresentation in senior leadership positions?
There's a number of different reasons. I think that there's this concept of a pie, and that, we're afraid that our slice of the pie will get smaller if we give more slices of the pie to others. And I think that changing that mindset to that there is enough pie for everybody, that we can all succeed together. And in fact, we do better when we all succeed together. So I think there's just this scarcity mindset that is a challenge when you say, why do people just not understand? Like, this is just a great thing. And I think it's because there's this scarcity of if I give over here, it's going to take away from me. And so I think we need to change that mindset. In terms of getting into leadership, I mean, I think it's just it's a very systematic challenge that starts from, grade school. I mean, I think it's, the images and expectations we have for our kids as they progress through school, the challenges that, many people of color face in society, and the lack of sponsorship and mentorship. When there's only 2 female Latina CEOs, where are the emerging Latina leaders going to get their advice from? We have to encourage others to support and mentor people that are different from them, so that our people of color have mentors and sponsors. Because there's a lot that happens organically, and I've seen it throughout my career. When I was going up through the ranks, it was so hard for me because I found, my male colleagues were playing golf and, having the happy hours that I wasn't having. And, that's where relationships build, networks build, advice gets flowed down. And so I had to go figure it out on my own. And so there's just all these little things, very micro, events that happen as you go through the corporate ladder, that make it very hard if you, don't have all of that support along the way. So I just do believe in communities and ERGs and mentorship, and all of those things really matter in supporting somebody.
Absolutely. And I think, from my standpoint, I hear that, and you use the word that I tend to use as well, which is, it's systematic, right? There's a systemic issue with that statistic.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at the demographics of our population, that statistic should not be that statistic, right? So so the system is working as it's designed to work.
Mm-hmm.
And the individuals that oversee that system, i.e. HR professionals and senior leaders, need to confront that head on and change the system.
Yeah.
And it's, so it's one thing to talk about it. And, I guarantee you that everybody listening to this podcast, we're pretty cultivated. We probably all agree with that statement, right? And we're inherently here to kind of disrupt systems and make things,
Mm-hmm.
better. Sometimes you have to break it to fix it again, right? But I think one of the challenges, and what's interesting with your book, is that you also need to be reflective enough with yourself before you can do that as well, right? Like you need to put your oxygen mask on first, right?
Yes.
So as we are thinking about ourselves as HR professionals, and we are aligned, we need to go out and we need to help others embrace their own power and their own identity. What are some things that we can do personally to make sure that we are prepared to be authentic to ourselves and to truly stay focused on our own individual vision and individual power?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a journey. And I like, Kyle, what you said about self-reflection. And I have lots of moments in the book where I ask they're called self-reflection moments, so that people can really consider how they're showing up in the workplace. And a lot, I was unconsciously really downplaying who I was, not only as a Latina, but as a working mother. When I started my career 25 years ago, I was in an all-male toxic environment, and I had no women in leadership, and I had nursed my baby in the parking garage because I didn't have a place to nurse her, and I downplayed being a mother. And so, what are the things that we are doing because we think it's the only way to make it in the corporate environment? What are the things that we're not bringing to the workplace? And some of those things that we're doing, we kind of have to do, based on the environment. That's the only way it's gonna, and you may be the sole breadwinner and may have to do that. But what are the things that you can change today, or make a plan to change in the next 12 months or, next couple of years, so that you can bring more of yourself to the workplace, and really unpacking, what those things are and what you're trying to adapt to, and how can you change that? Because I'll tell you that when you get on the other side of that and you let go of the fears, and you show up authentically, it's not only a gift to you, but it's a gift to everybody around you. And I think you asked at the beginning of the podcast, why did I write this book? It was more because I coming up in the ranks did not see a Latina leader. I mean, I told you the statistics; they're just not any. And I didn't realize that by me not showing up visibly, unabashedly visibly as a Latina, that what a disservice that was to all the other Latinas that are trying to make it and see no role models. And so showing up authentically is a role. You are a role model to the next generation who doesn't see anyone like you. No matter what, again, it doesn't have to be race. It can be any, normalizing mental health. That is something that many people struggle with, and we need to be honest about that struggle. So, I think self-reflection is the key.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, this is an audio only format, but when you started talking about assimilation, and you mentioned this earlier, but to me, it brought me right back to corporate 101, like right out of school. Like pretty quickly in certain cultures, you figure out you have to assimilate in order to move ahead. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many organizations that are like that. And if you haven't experienced that, it's still happening. It's probably just subconsciously happening.
Yeah.
But I think I would argue that our workplaces are seeing people fight against that now. That those cultures where you have to conform tend to not be embraced by people. And the other argument that I would say is those cultures are risky because you are missing out on an entirely extremely talented group of individuals that just won't work for you. And so it's like, I think it's such a terrible business strategy as well as just not a great place to work. So for somebody that's in that culture right now, and I hope there's not many of our listeners that are there, but I guarantee you there's still some things, there's still some cultures and some subcultures within our organizations where I guarantee that this still exists. What are some things that you would recommend that leaders and human resources practitioners need to do to try to kind of break this up and start to enact some of this culture change where, this drive to assimilate becomes much more inclusive of individuals' differences?
And I think what you said there, Kyle, was important, where you said qualified, highly talented people won't stay. And I think that, from a business perspective, that's right on point. And I think a lot of things are happening right now. There's Generation Z. I've got a daughter who's 20 years old, and let me tell you, they want to work, in their own terms. And if we're not ready for that, we're going to be behind the ball. We have the diverse workforce that is wanting to be seen. And then we have post-COVID, right? People got used to working remotely and the flexibility. And so if we as leaders are not listening to all of that, I think those organizations are going to be behind. And so inclusivity, I think, is more important than it's ever been for us. So, for HR leaders, I think, one important thing, I think there's you have to tackle it two different ways. One, I think you mentioned earlier, is this is not just an HR responsibility. This is a leadership responsibility, and it really has to start at the top. And I think really finding ways to talk with our C-suite executives about this is a responsibility for all C-suite executives to bring into their organizations and make it a strategic priority is important because, just HR doing it by itself is not going to be able to move the needle. It needs to have buy-in from everybody. So working with leaders and trying to get that buy-in is really critical. So that's at the top. Bottoms up, manager training. I mean, the most contact employees have is with their manager. And so you could be doing all the right things from a leadership perspective and trying to set the culture. But if your direct manager is not valuing your work, is not making you feel seen, isn't giving you the flexibility you need, isn't giving you the space to process recent, anti-Semitism that's happening, for example, like if you're not feeling seen and heard from your manager, you're gonna leave, because that's the person that's making you feel comfortable in your workplace. So I think manager training, one of the specific strategies I include in my book is, when you are having meetings, for example, and you have diverse perspectives in the room, don't make it the responsibility of that person to always be bringing up the unique point of view, because that makes it very hard to be always the one raising your hand. So instead, as a manager, you could say, okay, when you see a conversation going, everyone's kind of going in one direction, challenging the group and saying, okay, I want to hear the opposite of what we're all suggesting. What would that look like? How can let's think outside the box. Let's imagine if we did it differently. What does that look like? That's the opinion I want to hear. And now everyone is challenged with giving a diverse point of view. And that person who's always having to raise their hand with a different perspective isn't alone in that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's that's something that, first of all, it's just a great question to ask, right? Like,
yeah,
that's a value added question that somebody should be asking. And, to that point, honestly, I hadn't really even considered that context that, if somebody who is, has a different perspective or has a different context or different background, and they're always the one sharing that perspective, that's got to be exhausting at a certain point.
It's exhausting. Well, and then they give up, right? And that's what happens.
Right.
You just especially if that idea is continuously being dismissed, then you're like, okay, I'm exhausted, and obviously my opinion isn't being valued, and or the the organization isn't ready to hear it. So that's a piece of creating an inclusive environment.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners, our community, we like challenging the status quo, for obvious reasons. I mean, that's why we're listening to something with rebel in the title. But it's not always easy. And I think it's also, it can be challenging to kind of keep that spirit, especially when when it is always a point of conflict, or it falls on deaf ears. And so what tips do you have? And I know there's a lot of tips in the book here. But what are some tips that we can use to kind of keep ourselves motivated and make sure that we don't fall into this negative self-talk and kind of just kind of lose our steam on driving some of these positive changes?
Yeah, I think one is intention. And a lot of times, and I've seen this through organizations, there's a desire for diversity, there's a desire for inclusivity, but it doesn't happen without real specific intention. So being very intentional, creating very specific plans, not only annually, quarterly, monthly, to encourage and move the needle forward in all of the various DI objectives. I think, without intention, we're not going to really make progress. The second is getting comfortable being uncomfortable. I think that when you are part of a dominant group or majority, you're not used to being uncomfortable. And that's one, big thing that I've seen in different, again, being in both spaces. If you are part of if you are an other, you're very used to being uncomfortable. You've always been uncomfortable. You're the only one in the room. You're the other. And so that's not an unusual place to be. But some of these topics are challenging for people. It makes them uncomfortable and they don't want to feel uncomfortable. So I think normalizing that, maybe these conversations and topics are uncomfortable, but they're important, and moving through that feeling is really the way to make progress.
Absolutely. And I think I think it can be challenging sometimes, but going back to, really embracing the power of I think about it like, what's the consequence of us not doing that? Right.
Yeah.
Or if not us, then who?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, let's just be honest about, about where some of this change can happen.
Yeah. Well, and allyship, to your point, Kyle, is allyship is huge. As somebody who has, and I always talk about this also being sort of a relay race. If you're the one that is marginalized and you are coming in and fighting that fight every day, eventually you get to the point where you just can't keep going. It's exhausting. So I encourage those people to pass the baton to the next person and take a break, because you can't keep going. So you pass the baton and someone else runs the next lap. But for allies, it is so critical, because for those moments where the underrepresented or marginalized just can't, fight the fight the next time, or interrupt that bias or that microaggression that everyone kind of laughs at, or as allies, that is a huge amount of power. So it's not only embracing the power of you as the other, but embracing the power of allyship. You have a huge opportunity to really make a difference by using your voice and your power and your privilege to interrupt bias, to state the obvious, to challenge, and to be rebels, as you say. It's really, really powerful.
Absolutely. And I think, that's one of those areas where, I think my call to action for all the HR professionals here, where we can be allies, where we can take the baton, and support, in whatever shape that takes. That's an area that I passionately believe should be a core function of what we do in our organizations. And we should hold others accountable to do that as well. And I think that's truly where some of the change happens. With that being said, Tricia, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. I'm going to encourage all of our listeners to go out. Again, the book is Embrace the Power of You, Owning Your Identity at Work, available where books are sold. There's just an amazing amount of wonderful content to help you and to help your organization thrive. So with that being said, we're going to shift gears. We're going to go into the Rebel HR Flash Round. Are you ready?
Okay. Yes, I am. Thanks, Kyle.
All right. No pressure. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Question number 1. Where does HR need to rebel?
Oh, HR can rebel by saying the hard thing, right? I think we talked about allyship, but oftentimes it's easy to go along with the crowd and not rock the boat. And I think stating the obvious and calling it out, I think really the HR function can really be a support organization for many people that are struggling to belong.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Yeah. I typically don't comment on the flash round questions, but I do want to make a comment here. I think this conversation has been really important. And for me, it's one of the more important conversations that we need to have as HR professionals within an organization, because the reality is, in some organizations, human resources actually being authentic is rebelling.
I agree.
And so I would just tack onto that and be authentic yourself, HR professionals. Like I think that can cause a very positive ripple in your organization as well.
Yeah. So very good point.
And if you want to figure out how to do that, go pick up the book.
There you go.
We'll have the link in the show notes. There you go. We'll tie a bow on it. All right. Question number 2. Who should we be listening to?
A lot of my journey started with Brené Brown, and I will say, her TED Talk on vulnerability really shifted the way I viewed myself. It gave me the courage to reflect on who I'm bringing into the world, and the power of vulnerability of leaders. I think it all ties in. The core message of my book is belonging begins with self-acceptance. And until you can really believe in who you are, you're not going to get that sense of belonging in the workplace. And that all begins with just kind of unpacking yourself and your journey. So I love all of Brene Brown's books and podcasts, and I've listened to them all.
I couldn't agree more. It's all wonderful work. I'm a little bit ashamed to admit I was like late to the party. Like I didn't read the book until, or some of the books until just a few years ago. So I could not agree more.
Powerful.
And very, very powerful and very powerful personal story, that's shared very authentically as well. Right. So great. Yeah. Like a case study on why this is important. Right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
All right. Last question. So absolutely wonderful conversation. I guarantee you that our listeners are going to want to connect with you and learn more. So how can our listeners reach out and get their hands on the book and connect with you?
Yeah, you can find me at triciatimm.com, TRICIATIMM.com, and my website there. And I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram, and so you can find me there as well.
Absolutely. And we will have all that information in the show notes. Open up your podcast player and I would encourage you to get connected and check out the book. Tricia, it's been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you for investing the time and energy to put this content out there and for spending a couple minutes with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks.
All right. That does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.